welcome to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables, and whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a café au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the 101st episode of the SImple Sophisticate. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. It was a weekend of a little bit of work, a little bit of work in the garden, a little bit of relaxing, a little bit more work. And it was one of those weekends where it wasn't grand and something that I anticipated being wonderful, but it was actually quite fantastic. Isn't that the way, though? When we least expect it or when we don't expect it, amazing things happen. Just goes to show there's fantastic things that can happen in the everyday. All right. Today's episode 101, is all about growth. And we're going to talk about how it is a choice. It is a choice to grow, to change, to improve. And I'm going to outline 12 characteristics of what growth looks like when we choose to become a grown-up rather than just be an adult. And before I get to that, though, and I'll talk about the differences between an adult and a grown-up here in a minute, before we get to that, I am really excited to share with you this week's Petit Plaisir. It is something that I discovered in a book I was reading. It's been around 9 years, and I've just found it, but it is the fantastic addition to a list of Francophile finds that I'm always wanting to share with you guys. So whether you are someone who is a Francophile, someone who's trying to learn a language, or someone who just likes to take walks, that'll make more sense when I talk about it, trust me, tune in to today's Petit Plaisir, which will occur at the end of today's episode. But back to the topic of growth. It is a choice, and I'm going to break it down into 12 ways you can choose growth. Let's get started. So I want to start with a very simple quote from Kim Harrison. It goes something like this: growing up is hard, love. Otherwise, everyone would do it. In order for change, any kind of change to occur, there is a need for time and investment. In other words, there is a gap between wanting change and achieving change. And in that middle part is where the time and the investment must take place. The investment can come in the form of money or valuable time and attention. The process is not usually the part that we are eager to engage in, but rather the end result is the carrot that will lead us through the drudgery or exhaustion or the necessary discipline that we need in order to make that journey. Without the end goal in mind, the process might be something we would gladly bypass or simply just ignore and not do altogether. Here's some examples of not choosing to undergo the process. Settling into a relationship that is just okay. Staying in a job that is adequate. Or living a life that is manageable but not fulfilling. These are just a few of the ways that hold us back from choosing to grow any further because they're okay. They're okay. But we are uncomfortable of stepping out and changing because we know it's going to be a lot of work. And that is what often deters people, as the quote we started the episode with, deters people from making that extra step. It's hard. It's hard to grow up. It's hard to grow. But if we choose to grow, if we choose to go through the difficulties, if we choose to go through the part that's going to require discipline on our part, the investment, the time, that is when true contentment and unimaginable connection in relationships that we build and appreciation for the life that we will ultimately have, that's where that opportunity lives. We have to go through that process. We have to take on that growth. Last year, the topic of differentiating between being an adult and being a grown-up was discussed in a post titled Grown-ups versus Adult, the 15 Differences. And while that post focuses primarily on the behaviors of being a grown-up, such as how we dress, how we converse, how we handle our emotions, understanding what it really means to have it all, or giving us perspective. So whatever it is our perspective is, or how we handle relationships. That's what that particular post talked about. But today I'm going to share 12 opportunities for growth that, while learning these skills can take time and be difficult initially, the benefits will be enormous regarding the quality of your life in every arena. As someone myself who has always wanted to live on my own, from a young age, I've just really enjoyed and been curious about being on my own, being an adult, making my own decisions, and not being confined or limited by restraints or the limitations of age or maturity. I was naive, obviously, but I've always been curious about that. I've always also, though, been curious, and I still am to this day, as you probably know. And I think in many ways, when we remain curious, we will always remain young. So the key to living well and becoming a grown-up, I have found, is understanding that life can be both living in the real world, so being a grown-up, while hanging on to your youth so long as you choose a growth mindset. Beatrix Potter, I love this quote. Beatrix Potter puts it into words much more beautifully than I. She says, "I remember I used to half believe and wholly play with fairies when I was a child. What heaven can be more real than to retain the spirit world of childhood, tempered and balanced by knowledge and common sense?" So today, a bit of knowledge, as Potter puts it, to help us step into being a grown-up and open the doors to an even more fulfilling life. Let's get started. Number 1 is to choose joy. Let's start with a quote by Andre Gide. "Know that joy is rarer, more difficult, and more beautiful than sadness. Once you make this all-important discovery, you must embrace joy as a moral obligation." When I first read this quote, it gave me great pause and then an immediate smile, because the safe thing to do, the easy thing to do, is to worry, is to assume the worst, is to see the negative, is to feel sorry for ourselves. That's easy. To have hope, to see beauty, to find goodness is a muscle that needs to be exercised. It takes strength to be the joy seeker, because you may have to stand up or withstand pushback from the joy bullies in the world that can't tolerate someone else being happy if they aren't. So stay strong, find the joy, and live well. So number 1 is choose joy. Number 2 is knowing how to rise from adversity. A quote from Max Lerner: "The turning point in the process of growing up is when you discover the core of strength within you that survives all hurt." To be human is to know what it feels like to be hurt: a broken heart, dashed hope, grand disappointment, or a loss of trust. But when you discover that these hurts aren't going to kill you, after all, you're still standing, you discover, as Max Lerner points out, how much strength you actually have. And the key, however, is knowing how to rise from the hurt. Often people shove it under the rug, bury it somewhere deep, and they start to build walls for protection. Instead, though, as best-selling author Brené Brown points out, what we need to do is to do some investigating. In her most recent book, Rising Strong, she discusses the simple 2-step process of rising strong from adversity. In other words, rising successfully from adversity. Because we can all rise. It's either you choose to do it well, as she's going to talk about, or I'm going to share here in a second, or you, as I said, bury it, put a wall up. And yeah, you've risen, but you haven't done it well. And it's not going to help you in the long run. So there's 2 steps to her process. The first thing to do when you have fallen, when you've been hurt, how you rise is, number 1, engage with your feelings. Step into them. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. And number 2 is come to understand the story behind your feelings, why we think and behave the way we do. In other words, choose not to suppress, but rather to be the detective of why you feel the way you are feeling. Initially, this is very uncomfortable, and you will find ways to avoid it because if you're like me, you're afraid of what you may discover. But if you're also like me, you will discover when you choose to actually do that step number 2 and step in and do the investigating, you will discover that it is far less frightening of a monster than you had ever imagined. In fact, you will actually find something quite beautiful, the truth. And as they say, the truth will set you free. After all, we don't want to continue having the same negative response. We can't grow that way. And this is what helps us grow beyond that behavior that is not serving us well. So number 2 is growth is when we know how to rise adequately, effectively, progressively from adversity. Number 3 is we embrace a dynamic approach to life. To Pair Brown's 2-step process of rising strong is synonymous with this idea of a growth mindset. When we see our lives as dynamic rather than static, we know that we can change, we can grow, and we are not stupid or an idiot or a failure. And I put all 3 of those in air quotes because that's what a fixed mindset would think when a mistake happens or when we fall down. That's what a fixed mindset will say to ourselves in our own head, and that's not what we need to do. The actions that lead us to make such absolute comments, as just mentioned, come from, as I said, a fixed mindset. But if we choose to embrace a growth mindset, we are seeing each mistake as an opportunity for growth and improvement. And thus we can see ourselves as dynamic, forever capable of change and growth. So number 3 is that we embrace a dynamic approach to life. Number 4 is knowing how to live with uncertainty. Now, this may sound familiar if you've been listening to the podcast in the last few weeks. Last week in episode 100, I shared 10 ways content people live with uncertainty because, as we all know, we cannot control everything no matter what we do. So we must discover how to live with the unknowns and to live well while we do that. Without going into any more detail, because that whole episode and podcast will do that for you, I'll provide a link to that show on today's show notes. But it's episode 100, so last week's, and we dive deep into how to live with uncertainty and be content as you're doing it. So number 4, knowing how to live with uncertainty. Number 5 is being capable of knowing who is also a grown-up. Here's a quote from Maya Angelou. Most people don't grow up. Most people age. They find parking spaces, honor their credit cards, get married, have children, and call that maturity. What that is aging. It would be so much easier if people wore stickers on their foreheads saying either grown up or poser or pretending to be a grown up. But alas, such a simple label doesn't exist. And maybe it's actually a good thing that these labels are absent because we all have the potential and the choice at any given time to become a grown-up. And as we know, labels are limiting. So as much as we may want that label to help us navigate who we should engage with, who we should not, who we should invest in, who we should not, it's probably not a good idea. But how can we exactly determine if someone is a grown-up? Well, first, I encourage you to check out my post from last year, the 15 key differences between adults and being a grown-up. And we want to become a grown-up. That is a choice. You do not automatically become a grown-up. You may be adult in the eyes of the law because you're 18 or 21 or however you define the age, but it doesn't mean you're a grown-up. There's certain behaviors, there's certain ways that you go about your life and approach living that will define you as a grown-up. So look at that list. That'll help determine if someone else is a grown-up. But then also go through this list that we're going to talk about today, these 12 characteristics that we're talking about. And importantly, don't be fooled by the mistaken supposed proof that we assume makes someone a grown-up. As Maya Angelou points out, yes, a lot of grown-ups have children. There are also a lot of non-grown-ups that have children as well. Another telltale misnomer is someone's age. Oh, you're 45. You must be a grown-up. Okay, let's look a little further. I share both of these examples not to pick on parents or 45-year-olds, but instead to point out errant assumptions that can be avoided. And while it may take time to know for sure if someone is a grown-up, the investment will be worth it before you invest even more personally or professionally with that particular person who is posing as a grown-up. So number 5 is knowing how to determine if someone is a grown-up. Number 6, understanding what you need and being capable of communicating that to others tactfully. It takes time to know what you need. Such a discovery of ourselves is a journey that often can't be fully revealed to us until we are out on our own, making decisions, making mistakes, and seeing the world without the lens of the community and the culture we were raised in. By no means does this mean our communities or our parents were wrong, but we can grasp an unfiltered appreciation for what the world is and what we truly appreciate about it without being told. Experience, firsthand experience, is invaluable. And when you give this priceless gift to yourself, you become better acquainted with yourself. And as you choose to evolve into a grown-up, you choose to learn how to communicate and thus discover how to tactfully communicate what you need and what you can and cannot do. The gift of this skill of understanding what you need and then being able to communicate that tactfully to others will increase the quality of the relationships you choose to be in. If you are interested in learning how to perfect or to improve the art of communication in your own life, I have an entire post where we dive deep into that, and I'll provide a link to that on today's show notes. So be sure to check that out. So number 6 is understanding what you need and being capable of communicating that to others tactfully. Number 7 is that you recognize that weekends aren't the only time to have a good time. Patricia Briggs has a quote I'd like to share. One of the oddest things about being grown up was looking back at something you thought you knew and finding out the truth of it was completely different from what you had always believed. The weekend discovery is a specific example of a larger truth about being a grown-up. But the point is, just because the society or culture you live in gravitates or expects a certain behavior at a certain time of day or at a particular day of the week or on a certain time of year, holidays, for example, it doesn't mean you have to follow along. No big plans this weekend? No problem. Taking a mini getaway during the middle of the week to enjoy a quiet visit at your favorite destination sans tourists and out-of-towners? Go for it. The determining factor as to when you enjoy a good time need not be dictated by the masses. So number 7 is being able to recognize that weekends aren't the only time to have a good time. Number 8. This one ties with number 7, and it has to do with good time. So it's reveling in the beauty that having a good time isn't what everyone else is doing necessarily. Subsequently, what you define as a good time need not align with the masses either. There may be times that it does, but grown-ups have outgrown the need to apologize or explain why they enjoy a good time doing something different to someone who doesn't understand. Vive la différence, I say, and do your own thing. Dance to your own drum. If it aligns with other people, maybe you found a kindred spirit. And if it doesn't, celebrate the differences. So number 8 is reveling in the beauty that having a good time isn't what everyone else is doing. Number 9, being cool isn't a priority anymore. Woohoo, freedom! Chili Davis says it very succinctly. Growing old is mandatory. Growing up is optional. Cool can be defined in whatever way indicates someone is doing something because everyone else is doing it, or they are doing it to be ahead of the crowd so as to perhaps garner attention and envy, or maybe even jealousy. Similar to number 10. Which we'll talk about in a second. When you let go of worrying about whether the clothes you wear are in vogue or your technology is on par with everyone else's, you set yourself free. So number 9 is understanding that being cool is not a priority anymore. Number 10, letting go of needing the approval of others. Nicholas Sparks states, "It happens to everyone as they grow up. You find out who you are and what you want, and then you realize that people you've known forever don't see things the way you do. So you keep the wonderful memories, but find yourself moving on." When you have set you free from worrying about being cool, you have let go of seeking out the approval of others. And that is when the decisions you make will help build a life of true contentment. No more are you pursuing what you should, but rather what you love. And therefore you are truly engaged, truly invested, and ultimately quite inspiring to those around you. Nicholas Sparks' quote says it beautifully. But when you begin to drift from those who you've come to realize don't have similar tastes, views, or ways of living, Rather than become upset, become thankful for the memories you did have with them and move on, letting them move on as well, to find people who will celebrate in what life path you are now on and what life path they will then be on as well. So number 10 is letting go of needing the approval of others. Number 11, knowing the difference between looks and depth. Touched on briefly in episode 24 last year, the differences between women and girls. The key to being a grown-up is knowing that while we may find someone attractive, the package is stunning, we also know we need to look beyond the beautiful wrapping paper. Whether in our personal or professional life, looks don't equate to the best person for the job or the best person to date. Now, without question, how someone cares for themselves speaks volumes about their personal hygiene and self-respect, but making assumptions either way would be advised against. Again, as mentioned at the top of the episode, take your time, have patience, and then make your decision. Number 11 is knowing the difference between looks and depth. Last but not least, number 12 is becoming your best friend. Amy Lambert Becker states, "We grow neither better nor worse as we get old, but more like ourselves." A grown-up is someone who enjoys their own company, doesn't shy from time alone, doesn't try to numb themselves when they are alone, and revels rather than runs from who they are. When we become our own best friend, we can never be truly alone. Granted, we do need human connection and social involvement. Each of us has a different level of how much we need. But one of the biggest aha moments for most people is that when they become their own best friend, their lives become all the more enjoyable because whether they are with people or not, they will always be having a good time. Perhaps more guaranteed so in the former scenario than the latter. So number 12 is becoming your best friend. When you do that, you are stepping into being a grown-up. You are. And you begin to always make decisions that you can live with, that your conscience lives with, and does so proudly. You can be very pleased with the decisions. And a lot of those decisions are not going to be easy, but when you make them and you continue to move forward, you look back, and that's the part that makes it easier to be in your own company because you are confident in where you're going and how you're living. One of the biggest gifts I have discovered as I continue to choose to grow and learn and step more fully into the role of being a grown-up is that things that popped up unwanted that I used to become so angst-ridden about, my finances or my social life or my career path, are now seen as mere bumps that I need to navigate around skillfully because I have more experience, because I have become even more comfortable with my own company, and I have addressed areas of weakness that I could not figure out on my own. Are there more ways to grow and learn and evolve even after we have addressed the 12 characteristics we just talked about today? Absolutely. Because here's the thing. The 12 characteristics we just talked about are very much like muscles that we have to keep moving and practicing, keeping them in shape. The same scenarios will not keep popping up in our lives, but rather new versions that will test these 12 characteristics, that will test to make sure we really do know how to not be, drawn to the pretty face and not dive deeper, or learn how to communicate tactfully in a difficult situation where we have to let people know what we can and cannot do. But with each time we practice the skill, the new version will become easier to engage with successfully. I want to leave you with a quote by E.E. Cummings. He states, "It takes courage to grow up and become who you really are." I encourage you today with today's episode to choose to be a grown-up and never stop growing. It may just be one of the best decisions you'll ever make. For all of the show notes and links that I talked about, the book from Brene Brown and past posts from the archives that dive deeper into some of the topics we talked about, visit the show notes at thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 101, and you'll find everything there. But now stay tuned for this week's Petit Plaisir, as I have a Francophile Find you're not going to want to miss. I'll see you in just a few. All right, so welcome back. This week's Petit Plaisir is coffee break French. Now, I kind of have a twofer for you because how I came about this podcast, how I learned about it, was from Flirting with French. It is a fantastic book by William Alexander. And one of the resources that he mentioned that he had listened to or used to help him learn the French language was this podcast called The Coffee Break French. And it is just 15 to 17 minutes each episode. And it started actually way back in 2007. Where have I been? Hello. But there are over 200 episodes. I am only on episode 5. But I listened to 4 episodes just recently. And I have been speaking French on my walks, on the hikes, and on the trails. I'm sure that people that I can't see but that can hear me are like, who and what is she doing? She's communicating and having a conversation with somebody that's not there. But it is very simple. And I think for me, I like the basics shared with me, and I like to be able to verbalize it and practice it. I am a very visual learner, so this is a compliment to the classes I'm taking. But it's nice just to have that practice on your own and just to hear yourself say it, figure out how to wrap your tongue around some of the phrases and the words. And it's very easy to do. I'm telling you, if you're starting from scratch, start with this. Even if you're not starting from scratch and you just want to review, or you're traveling to France in the near future and you just want to refresh your French skills, I highly recommend this podcast. And the good thing is it's also paired with an entire website that breaks these down, gives you even more help on the topics. For example, the first lesson was just simply about having a conversation, asking someone how they are. Comment ça va? Ça va bien, merci, et toi? And you practice that and you get the basics, and it's just very, very simple. But again, the repetition, the practice, it's not too overwhelming. I absolutely love it. And they have one for other languages as well. Coffee Break Spanish, I believe, started this whole podcast series. But anyway, I'll provide a link to not only the podcast, but also the website so you can check it out. And who knows, if you see me walking the dogs and I'm speaking to nobody, you probably know what I'm trying to do. Trying to improve my French, which needs a lot of work. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petit Plaisir, where each week ideas are shared to make the everyday all the more enjoyable. Tune in at the end of each Monday's podcast, where I'll recommend a book, a film, or a podcast. Anything that is a simple pleasure to satiate your sophisticated taste. Thank you for tuning in today, guys. I hope you have a lovely week. Thank you for tuning in to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide, to stay caught up on the most recent podcast, blog posts, and receive exclusive news and an extra dose of inspiration, which arrives each Friday morning to enjoy with a hot cup of tea or your morning coffee, just in time to jumpstart the weekend. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonne journée!